Hello again. This week's episode is about our Cletrac 20K. We discovered what that banging noise was in the final drive, as well as why the engine was a little stiff turning over. And we're going to share both of those with you today. During the process, we've learned quite a bit about this machine, and we're going to share that with you as we go along. But what I'm most happy about is originally we knew that this machine was from 1925 to 27, but we did confirm today that this machine is a 1925, and it's actually the 816th one manufactured. When running the K20, we heard a loud pop coming from the right rear, and you can see there's a lot of grease that came out of it. So we're going to have to pull that drive off. But then there's also a lot of movement in this front idler, so that bushing is definitely shot as well. So we have to remove the track to get to all of that. So we're going to remove this pin here. You can see someone has used what looks like some piston pin bushings as a roller there. And it's got a nail holding it in. So we're going to cut the head of the nail off and pull that out so we can pop the pin, get the tracks out of the way, and then we'll be able to find out what's going on with the drive gear and the idler. With the head cut off the nail, we're going to start pulling this nail out. And there we go. Now we have to see how hard it's going to be to drive the pin through it. The first pin we couldn't get to move, and we found one that didn't have a key in it. So we started hitting on it, and as you can see, it was coming out. So we just got to hit on a little bit more, and then we should be able to separate the tracks. Put the nut back on backwards, put some pressure with a pry bar on the drive gear outward, and then by tapping on the spindle we were able to remove the sprocket. With the perimeter bolts out of the housing, we can now pull it off and see what happened inside here. Oh boy! We're using an old wheel to act as a support for the housing while we knock the axle through. There we go. Again, notice that we used a nut on the axle shaft so we don't mess up the threads. Now we'll get that bearing out of there and clean it up to see if we can reuse it. Sometimes running them back in and then back out a couple of times along with some penetrating oil, you're a little more successful in removing them. With the nuts off the idler cap, we're using a pry bar to take the idler out. Next, working it side to side to take it off nice and even, so it doesn't bind on the studs. There we go. Now we're knocking out the axle pin so we can remove the axle. There's our bushing. Here Mac is removing the caps that retain the shaft that holds on the undercarriage so we can get the one side off. Knowing we have bad rollers on this machine, we're taking out the entire drive. So the leaf spring is loose from the main frame and the caps are off from the shaft. So now we're going to drive the shaft out just enough to get that drive off. So knowing that we've got a lot of play in the rollers, we're going to be rebushing these. So we flip this over. Now we're taking off each of the roller assemblies. Since the splines in the drive of our 20K are bad, we're going to pull the transmission apart on this old one and see if we can utilize the gear from this. So our machine is a serial number 916, which is extremely early. It's somewhere between a 25 and a 27. Unfortunately, there's no literature to tell us exactly which year. But this one is a little bit later. As you can see, there's a bearing here after pulling the cap off, where mine doesn't have that. And Mr. Zimmerman explained that they did some upgrades when there were things that weren't working quite correctly. So we might be able to utilize this housing in that axle. So we're pulling it apart now to see. You can see right here that this spline should be this width all the way down to the end, but you see how it tapers off and gets to a very thin piece of metal here, and it's doing it all the way around. And inside the gear, you can see the splines there are extremely thin, just like they are on the axle. So there was a lot of free play there, as you saw when I was moving it. So what was going on is when the tractor was being driven, especially into a turn, the teeth were actually walking over each other, and that's where the banging was coming from. Looks like this axle and drive assembly is going to fit right into our machine. So the next thing we're going to do is pull it out of the machine and see if the axles are the same length and diameter, so that we'll know that we can use them. We know now that the axle shafts are identical, splines and all. So with the outboard bearing, that does give it a lot more support and probably makes it stronger, which is why they did the upgrade. So we will be able to use this axle with that housing and bull gear. We're just going to pull the housing or the bull gear assembly apart and replace the bearings first. Here are the two axles for our Cletrac, the original one that came out of the machine, and then the updated version. And here's what's different about them. You can see that the drive gears for the bull gear are here, and they're the same. There's a bearing behind this gear that goes into the housing, and then you have this much of the gear to the outside of the bearing. But this one actually uses a bearing on the outside of the gear, so it gets more support. So the axle is being supported on one end and completely on the other end, so that's what makes it a little more durable. So once we get our new bearing, we'll be pressing that on, and it'll have the upgrade, so it will last a lot longer. Something else I want to show you about the axle from the original machine and where that banging was coming from is that this gear comes off. It has internal splines and external splines on the axle itself, and I want to show you what was making that noise. You can see right here that this spline should be this width all the way down to the end, but you see how it tapers off and gets to a very thin piece of metal here, and it's doing it all the way around. And inside the gear, you can see the splines there are extremely thin, just like they are on the axle. So there was a lot of free play there, as you saw when I was moving it. So what was going on is when the tractor was being driven, especially into a turn, the teeth were actually walking over each other, and that's where the banging was coming from. But with this axle, since the gear is actually machined as part of the shaft and the bearing is supporting it from the outside, we don't have to worry about that happening again. We have one of the housings on a bench that we're going to clean up. Before we do that, we're going to cut the safety wire and remove those bolts that are retaining the bearing, and we're going to pull that bearing out and check it. It looks like a couple of the bearings we can reuse, but we need to clean them all up and inspect them before we can make that decision. So the washers on the bolts retain the outer race. Now that we know which bearings we can reuse and which ones we have to replace, we're getting the housing cleaned up really well so we can start getting it put back together. Here we're pressing the old bearing off of the axle shaft. We won't have the new bearings for the final drive until next week, so while we're waiting, Mac's removing the oil pan from the 20K to find out what happened when it got a little hot and it's being a little difficult to turn over. So the pan out of the way, you can see our rod caps, and what we noticed is that the number 2 is extremely tight. There is no end play in that one at all. The other 3 have some, so I'm assuming it's a shimmed type. So what we're going to do is take the 4 nuts off of that cap by removing the cotter pins first and removing the nuts, And if the engine spins over freely, then we found the culprit. And we'll take that cap off, see what we need to do to shim it to get it right, and then that should take care of the hard start problem. In knocking out the axle for the front idler to get to the bushing, we've had a couple of issues we had to deal with. Number one, we had to find a way to support the idler so that the axle could fall through, and our press wouldn't allow for that to happen because it was too big on the other side. Then also some way to drive this out, since we couldn't use a press without hurting anyone and having to hold anything with a sledgehammer. So what we've done is we've developed this little tool here out of a piece of axle and pipe, so that'll allow Mac to hold the tool steady and away far enough from my 20-pound sledgehammer so yes, it doesn't have to worry about getting hurt, and we should be able to drive the pin out successfully. So let's give it a try. So we've bottomed out against the floor, so now what we can do is put a couple of 2x4s under the idler to get it up off there a little bit and then get it the rest of the way out. We're almost there. We got the axle out successfully. What we've noticed here is there's a considerable amount of wear on this side, a little bit here, but this one is much worse, so that's where a lot of that play was coming from in the idler. The proper way to fix this would be to weld all of that shut and then mill it back down with a lathe and get it back to its 1.5 inch diameter. Mac and I were just talking, and we think we found a different way to attack this where it's going to be a little bit easier and will still work fine for what we're doing. Well, we're not going to put this machine back to farm use and be abusing it every day. So we may have come up with a better plan to get this idler back together, and we'll be sharing that with you soon. This is a 1951 Farmall Cub. It belongs to a gentleman out of Stafford named Jack Morse. It currently has a no start. After doing a compression test on it, all the cylinders are very low. So it is a candidate probably for re-ringing, possibly new pistons, but we're going to be pulling this apart very soon, and then we will know. So hopefully you'll see this next week as we've at least got it apart and determined what it needs. Next time on Bulldog Builds, we'll have the new bearings installed in our final drive and put back onto the tractor. We'll have that number 2 rod cap taken care of and put back onto the engine as well. And believe it or not, the Harley is finally finished and ready for its maiden voyage. See you next week.